We live in divided times, an age of rising populism and tribal identity politics. But many of the arguments that divide us today had their origins decades ago. Since I was born in 1945, epic changes have marked our country. The end of empire.
The tide of Britain's imperial power has ebbed.
The dawn of mass immigration.
The empire windrush brings to Britain 500
social and sexual revolutions. Fierce battles over our land. Time and again, these transformations have made us ask, who are we now? We can't look for answers just in the speeches of politicians, the daily news cycle, and certainly not in the blare of social media. Rather, we should search where the beating heart of a society truly lives, our common culture.
Culture's always upstream of politics. That's why culture matters.
It's the arts that have heralded dramatic changes in our lives.
It just made me think, oh yeah, we do exist, or we do count in some way.
Movies that bite back against convention.
Don't let the bastards grind you down, that's one thing I've learned.
Paintings that turn the tables on those who look and those who are looked at. Music, poetry and fiction that cross tribal boundaries.
I'm often considered to be a funny kind of Englishman, a new breed, as it were.
In the most tumultuous times, our culture does more than merely capture the changing face of Britain. The arts connect us in rare and precious moments.
Together, they tell us the complicated, gloriously contentious story of us.
I was 3 months old when the Second World War came to an end. Arriving into a Britain jubilant in victory, but broken and bankrupted by what it had taken to achieve it. A country divided by class and much else had pulled together in the war. But could that unity hold? What did it mean to be British now and in the future? Was it the defense of tradition, or was it its opposite, our no-holds-barred talent for reinventing ourselves? One answer, improbably, came out of the ruins.
In these painful, dark years after the war, there was rubble everywhere. I remember saying later on to my dad, did you realize when the war ended and everyone was so joyous that there was going to be another 6 years of heaviness, of real difficulty? And he said, no, we all thought it was going to be like the night the war ended, really, the kind of knees up forever. No, knees were very definitely down.
What was needed, the new Labour government decided, was a great national cheering up, an antidote to bleakness.
It's now been decided to hold a Festival of Britain in 1951, and the site has been selected on the south bank of the Thames.
I see this festival as a symbol of Britain's abiding courage and vitality. Come to see what this old country can do. I declare the Festival of Britain open.
So from the bombed-out wastelands of the south bank of the Thames arose a thrilling vision of modernist architecture, art and design, a huge exhibition that romanced the British past while it heralded a jet-propelled techno-vision of the British future.
It was 1951 when the 6-year-old me came. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Apart from the broken buildings, everything was like the Houses of Parliament or Trafalgar Square. It was dark and heavy and solemn. This was light and bright and screamingly coloured. There was a belief that Britain had tanks of joy and creativity and brightness and experimental bravery.
The first thing I ever fell in love with, bug-eyed, rapturously, was a gleaming tapered steel cylinder which seemed miraculously to float and bob above the crowds.
Here we are speaking to you now from the very summit top of the Skyloft. How high is it, Mr. Taggart?
300 feet from the ground to the tip.
The Skyloft, you couldn't look at it and not be completely spellbound. This 300 feet tall, beautiful, pointy-ended piece of metal that wanted to ascend. It was the Britain that was going to literally take off. And it was just a thing of beauty. It seemed to me to come out of some perfect comic book, you know, Dan Dare's space travel. It was a way to feel that Britain, of all places, embraced the new. Actually, the happiness of being British was the sense that now we would call cutting edge. This lovely thing is the official program for the Festival of Britain. You needed to have it because there were so many pavilions, 22 really big pavilions. But it's also a kind of manifesto of what the point of the Festival of Britain is. It says, the festival is nationwide, all through the summer and through the land. Its spirit will be finding expression in a variety of British sights and a great range of British sounds. Taken together, these will add up to one united act of national reassessment. And every so often in British history, that's what you need. People could think for a moment about what it meant to be British, you know, what this particular moment in time, we'd won the war, we'd survived the worst that Hitler could throw at us. Where does Britain go from now?
Throughout the summer of 1951, the exuberance of the main festival was reproduced in countless events all over the UK. From travelling displays on land and sea to exhibitions in Glasgow, Cardiff and Belfast. Almost every city, town and village held their own celebrations.
Britain's festival was on show last week. It was always a shin-kicking contest,
with British eccentricity doing its thing.
They included such sports as pitching the
It's all part of Chipstead's festival celebration.
Presiding over it all was one ubiquitous icon.
The figure who designed the cover for the programme was one of the great British geniuses of design, a man called Abram Games.
The son of East End Jewish immigrants, Abram Games was Britain's official World War II poster artist, unmatched for his brilliant visual marriages of modernism and patriotism. In 1948, he won a competition to create the symbol of the festival. Repurposing Britannia on the British penny coin as the emblem of the new Britain unveiled on the South Bank.
And then underneath Britannia, reimagined, is bunting in the colours of the Union Jack, red, white and blue. And it was said that he got the idea of bunting from looking at the washing hung out on the washing line in the back garden in Golders Green, which would have been very familiar to me. Abram Games felt equally passionate about being Jewish and being British. Games said he felt intensely Jewish, but his life was devoted to making the kind of pride and pleasure in being British visible. And, you know, I think about that now, really, when we're all imprisoned in our little identity tribes. And there's so much problematic, not unproblematic, about which particular version of being British you might be.
8.5 million people visited and enjoyed the different versions of Britishness on offer at the festival, which didn't mean it went uncriticised. As the brainchild of Labour's Herbert Morrison, it was unlikely to get a warm reception from Churchill's Conservatives. It would cost too much, be a popular flop, and so on. A common barb was that my beloved Skylon, much like the British economy under Labour, had no visible means of support. And the perfect emblem of the new, technologically sleek Britain ended up in the breaking yard of a scrap merchant, as demolition of the site rapidly pressed ahead, when Churchill and the Conservatives narrowly won a general election that October.
Were standing on the balcony of the Festival Hall. That was all that remained. Everybody knew that the Festival of Britain was actually going to be demolished at the end of it. But when the Lord Mayor of London declared the Festival of Britain closed, he was greeted with tremendous booing. The people were actually really upset, aggrieved, not just sad, I think, aggrieved about it all disappearing.
Symbolically, it felt like the revenge of tradition.
And behind that was the real sense that the Conservatives had won the election, Churchill was back in power. He wasn't going to have any of this, arty approach that modernism was the new Britain.
Though the public loved the festival, it could be no more than a fleeting moment of national togetherness, a hit from a happy pill that was never going to solve all of Britain's deep-rooted problems. Especially not the discontents and divisions of class. At the festival, you could ogle the finished products of industrial Britain, but you never heard from the people who made them. Those who oiled the parts, who felt treated like machines themselves and didn't much like it. But by the end of the 1950s, you could open a book by writers from factory towns and port cities, or go into a cinema and you'd hear them, at last talking back, the full bloody cheek of them.
954. 950 bloody 5. Another few more and that's a lot for a Friday. £14 3 and twopence for 1,000 of these a day. No wonder I've always got a bad back. That'll soon be done. I'll have a fag in a bit. No use working every minute God sends.
A film was made in the streets of Nottingham from a novel written by a man born there, Saturday night and Sunday morning. The author was Alan Sillitoe.
The hero of the novel, rather tempestuous man with a profound discontent. I mean, what is he discontented about?
Well, it depends what you mean. The discontent could be the sort of human condition, which I think most of the time is discontent. And I would say that this discontent often manifests itself in sort of social ways.
There was a fundamental part of me that didn't like being told what to do, especially by those who didn't know what the effort of doing it meant. I was an individual.
Born into abject poverty, the fiercely anti-establishment writer Alan Sillitoe left school at just 14 and worked as a lathe operator at the Raleigh Bike Factory in Nottingham.
As on the playground, and now in the factory, I daydreamed and fixed the faces, habits and possible histories of the people around me in my mind, almost without realizing it, and certainly not knowing the use I would one day put it to.
That use would be Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, a book that in 1959 changed everything I thought I knew about novels of the people. And just a year later, the film adaptation scripted by Sillitoe electrifyingly brought to life his rebellious anti-hero, Arthur Seaton, played by young Albert Finney, all bantam-cock strut, full of beer, sex and devilry.
Don't let the bastards grind you down, that's one thing I've learned. I'd like to see anybody try to grind me down, that'd be the day. What I'm out for is a good time. All the rest is propaganda.
Arthur's voice is Sillitoe's, of course. To hell with the pieties. And us suburban wannabe teenage rebels...
Well, there it is.
Ate it up.
Fantastic kind of holy relic of a revolution, really. The final draft shooting script for Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. The reason why it's so brilliant is it's of his own personal experience. Filmed in a world Sillitoe himself grew up in Nottingham. The back streets and the alleys, the terrace houses and the pubs. You absolutely feel that authenticity.
Hey, Arthur.
It was a totally different kind of British film. Everything about it was sweaty with truth.
You've got to be as cunning as them bastards.
You got a bit of lipstick on your love. There.
Pioneering director Carol Rice was known for his gritty documentary making.
Yeah, you can't beat.
And his and Sillitoe's talents together delivered us our very own Jimmy Dean, a subversive British Brando for the generations.
I've still got some fight left in me, not like most people.
Whoa, look at this. It's so vividly written. First thing that Arthur says is 954. Whoa, this is a different sort of film. You know, you see the kind of creative fire burnt into it. Don't let the bastards grind you down. That's one thing I've learned. This, for us, was the modern Shakespeare, it really was. What I want is a good time. All the rest is propaganda. Throwing a Molotov cocktail at British self-satisfaction.
I'm a dynamite dealer waiting to blow the factory to kingdom come. I'm me and nobody else. Whatever people say I am, that's what I'm not. Because they don't know a bloody thing about me.
Most British films were nourished on heroics. They were always kind of working class types who are doing the, you know, the kind of wartime equivalent of tugging a forelock a bit. They're cheerful in adversity. Arthur is the opposite, you know.
Oh, truth!
This is not. I don't give a shit. This is a really wonderfully kind of bloody, cheeky anti-hero.
It's an attitude that stayed in the DNA of British culture. Decades later, I heard it in punk, and then again in Britpop.
You wanna live like common people.
Through the wicked cleverness of Sheffield's Jarvis Cocker and Pulp, for whom Sillitoe and Seaton were a big influence.
Sleep with common people like me, but she didn't understand, and she just smiled and held my hand.
Pandora's box is opening.
Yeah, I know.
I think the first time I saw the film, I wasn't sure what to make of him because he looked like kind of rough kids at school who would pick on me, basically.
Yeah.
I wasn't a hard kid.
Yeah.
Even though he scared me a bit. It was something recognisable, you know, it was something that I recognised from my life. One thing that wasn't familiar about it was that he was working. Because when I left school, that was around the time when all the industry ground to a halt in Sheffield. It was like the late 70s, early 80s. So the world that's portrayed in the film had already disappeared, like a lot of places in the world. That's what I was born into. That kind of feeling, you know, what's everybody going to do now?
Yeah.
Films like this were a big inspiration to discover these things through seeing them on the TV. You know, it would be exciting. In that first monologue that he does, and he said, "Don't let the bastards grind you down," and it gave you some clues or some kind of, I don't know, validation in some way.
Yeah.
Because of the attitude. Albert Finney's so cocky in this.
So this sort of cheeky swagger, you know, up yours attitude, really.
Well, yeah.
Jarvis Cocker, lead singer of British band Pulp, ran on stage. He danced and allegedly made V signs at Michael Jackson before being bundled off by security staff.
These things were quite precious, you know, to people from the North because it just made you think, oh, yeah, we do exist or we do count in some way. Seeing this film and others like it were an encouragement, I suppose, to realise that you could write about your own surroundings. You didn't have to kind of tune into some interstellar frequency.
Oh, we were born within an hour of each other. Our mother said we could be sister and brother.
It's hard to imagine that there was a big sector of society that was invisible in terms of culture in the 60s. When this film came out, it was like a revelation. It was like, oh, you know, pulling the carpet up and seeing what was underneath it and making it visible for the first time.
The X-rated film was a staggering success, making its entire budget back within a fortnight and winning 3 BAFTAs.
What a film, what a performance. Best British film yet.
Despite courting controversy.
The film is doing outstanding business, except in Warwickshire, where it's been banned. A lot of people say this is the beginning of the end of virtue and traditional values in Britain. The MP for Nottingham said it was a foul libel against the clean living people of Nottingham.
Hey, come here.
Predictably, it was the film's unfiltered depictions of sex that sparked many of the protests.
You see him going round to the married woman, Brenda, with whom he's having an affair. It's amazing, because it's not only having sex with a married woman, but also she is so up for it.
Don't let's stay down here too long. Let's go upstairs.
And they're completely unrepentant.
What's the time we had last night?
You know, it was absolutely raw. This was the movie equivalent of late-night fish and chips soaked in vinegar.
The film didn't turn a blind eye to the consequences of all that fun in bed.
What's the matter with you tonight?
I'll tell you what's the matter with me, Arthur. I'm pregnant. Good and proper this time. And it's your fault.
Oh, well, it's better be my fault, isn't it?
Well, of course it is. You never take care. You just don't bother.
Nor did it flinch from the fact that women and men paid a very different price for their pleasure. In fact, the tough new wave of British movies were obsessed by it. All of the most acclaimed appearing just before the contraceptive pill became widely available. A Kind of Loving, A Taste of Honey.
I'm going to have a baby.
Yes, I thought so. You're in a bit of a mess, aren't you?
And The L-Shaped Room featured women punished and damaged by their unwanted pregnancies. But as the 60s started to swing, there were many women who'd had quite enough of sexual powerlessness. One of them was a spectacularly gifted artist who delivered a whole new kind of female agency. Pauline Boaty, a talent all but forgotten for decades, was Britain's first woman pop artist. The first to make the way women were looked at and the way they looked back the driving theme of her work.
A revolution is on the way, and all over the country young girls are sprouting, shouting and shaking. And if they terrify you, they mean to. They're not going to be squashed, and certainly don't intend to be wallflowers.
Until Boaty showed up, men had overwhelmingly monopolized images of the female body as objects of male desire.
Men are the ones who talk, who act, who do. The little woman won't be heard. We'll never know what she thinks, and it's assumed she doesn't.
But Boaty sure did. Her subject was sex, the way women saw it and wanted it, starting with her own passionate fantasies.
Instead of art being absolutely turgid with what men fancy in women, hello, the whole history of the nude, this turns the tables completely. This is the first of her big, colourful paintings. It's the first time you've got a visual representation of female lusty desire. This fabulous hot crush of painting is a film star, Jean-Paul Belmondo, who featured in New Wave French cinema. Pauline Boaty absolutely lusted after him. She's painted his face, of course, in the movie Black and White, in which he saw him. And everything else, these very hot colours, this gorgeous orange. She said orange, you know, is the colour of desire for her. And on top of the straw hat is this massive rose, it doesn't take any feat of the imagination to look at that flower and its center to see what she's getting at. This, growing sense of massive bodily lusts. This painting, Belmondo, is How About My Desire? This is done for me.
The red rose was a recurring feature in Boaty's smash-and-grab reclamation of female pleasure. But she was an unlikely rebel. Before escaping to Wimbledon Art College, where she specialised in stained glass, she was raised in a strict suburban household where her accountant father overcompensated for his Belgian-Persian background by obsessive devotion to English habits.
Her dad, who was the most uptight, conservative, super English person, have to have trimmed cucumber sandwiches every day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but whose obsession was rose gardening. And her dad was the person who said, "You're not going to art school." So this is revenge on Dad's gardening. This is erotic horticulture. It's really completely wonderful. She has herself photographed naked in front of this painting. It's a playful thing, but it's sort of incredibly original. It's really brazenly powerful, sort of switching from being an object to actually saying, this is how I feel. Live with it.
There was no stopping her. When she had herself photographed with the Belmondo, she was violating one of art's most sacred principles. The model doesn't get to be the artist, much less have fun switching roles, taking control, doing a double eyeful.
Poor retiring English females, so unsure of their sexuality, their femininity. Some women just don't want to be a female nonentity.
All the while confronting the viewer as both a sexual woman and a serious artist.
I'm the artist as nude. I'm the nude as artist. A great many men don't understand a woman full of joy, even more don't understand paintings full of joy by a woman.
Award-winning writer Ali Smith found Boaty a powerful muse for her 2016 novel Autumn, weaving the artist story into the narrative.
Artist from the 1960s, Elizabeth says. The only British female pop artist. Ah, Zoe says. I didn't know there were any. There were, Elizabeth says.
Ali discovered Boaty by chance when an image in a magazine caught her eye as the artist's work began to be revisited after years of being overlooked.
Who is this artist? Who is this person? Extraordinary artist like nobody else, ahead of the game, ahead of the time. A proper pioneer in all of the forms that she used.
Yet our only record of some of Boaty's paintings are the photographs of her with them. Foremost is a painting of Christine Keeler, the model and showgirl caught up in the Profumo scandal that rocked British politics in 1963.
Mr. Macmillan walks through Euston Station to the biggest domestic crisis of his life, the Profumo affair.
The war minister was involved with a girl who was close to a Russian naval attaché.
Mr. Profumo resigned, saying that he had misled Parliament about his relationship with Christine Keeler, in which there had been impropriety.
Power and politics in the early 60s turned on, Christine Keeler, who'd been reduced famously, to that photograph of her naked.
What you've got in Scandal 63 in this missing picture, Boaty takes an image which looks like a really famous image of Christine Keeler, except Boaty shunts it a couple of frames along, and she goes one hand, like the thinker. She lets Keeler be the thinker. She takes an image and she just slightly skews it. She is pointing out the inequalities. She is making clear how imagery is used. There's power, there's politics, and there's sexuality, and there's distraction. The distraction is Keeler. There she is. She's a new naked woman on the back of a chair, so that you won't think about the nuclear powers and the spies and the things which have actually happened, which are behind the lies in Parliament. And she was asking those questions then in the way that nobody else was.
That's the finger pointing at you.
The bomb.
More than any artist before, and from personal experience, Boaty understood the way women's lives and images are manipulated, and so too the trap of glamour.
Here's Pauline Boaty painting one of the people she loved and admired most, Marilyn Monroe. Very importantly, in 1962, in the year of Marilyn Monroe's death. I think there is sort of double edge, really, about her relationship with the kind of blonde sexuality and enormous appeal of Marilyn Monroe, in that Pauline Boaty was known as glamorous. She reveled in her own beauty. She'd been called the Wimbledon Bardot when she was at the Wimbledon College of Art. But at the same time, of course, she also saw that when you did that, you could become objectified. And it grates on her, makes her feel pissed off. No one would expect you to have a brain, she often said this, to have a mind, if you were so beautiful and so sexy. And Marilyn Monroe, she felt classically, had made a career out of this astonishing sensual appeal and was a terrible victim of it. The year she paints this is also the year in which Andy Warhol very famously produced his first multiple silkscreen portrait of, who else, Marilyn Monroe. But apart from that, the two approaches could not possibly be more different. What Warhol's interested in is a Marilyn Monroe in which the human personality has been completely emptied, has been kind of transformed into the equivalent of a soup can. This is precisely the opposite. You have an incredibly immediate, and even though she's dead, a sort of living, breathing, warm, pulsing personality close up. So you're in the kind of aura of this particular woman's warmth in all her glory and all her tragedy.
It would prove hauntingly prescient. A terrible coda awaited Boaty and her husband, the cruelest fate conceivable, one that turned her own body into a fatal enemy.
She gets pregnant. During an examination, it's discovered she's got a terrible cancer, and she decides against radiation therapy so that the baby won't be harmed, and sacrifices herself.
She died on the 1st of July, 1966, just 5 months after giving birth.
She's 28 years old, very touching and desperately sad.
And yet, the last thing she painted while she was very ill was, in its rather glorious way, peak Pauline. Bum was commissioned by her friend, Kenneth Tynan, for his erotic cabaret show, Oh, Calcutta, a winking title that also meant in French, Oh, quel cul tu as. What an arse you have. Boaty's painting was a final, cheeky provocation, and for a great many people, it and Tynan's play were the last straw. Things had gone too far, too fast.
Lady Burber, what were your particular objections to O Calcutta?
Well, the sickening perversion I found in it.
The abolition of theatre censorship in the late 1960s, amid a flood of pornographic materials, would prove a flashpoint for the soul of the nation, evidence of a descent into a moral abyss.
I cannot believe for a moment that the British public would ever tolerate the sort of thing I saw last night.
The fight back was spearheaded by a Labour peer, Lord Longford, who set up a commission in 1971 to investigate the impact of pornography on society.
Surely every decent person is biased against pornography. You might say it's simply being biased against filth. The question is how to overcome pornography.
Harnessing culture for the cause, he persuaded a pop megastar to join him.
What made you agree to take part?
Well, only that I think if I can be part of something that is going to help, combat immorality and so forth, I think I'd like to be part of it.
How serious do you think the situation is at the moment?
It doesn't look particularly healthy. The attitude that general people have towards pornography and the sort of permissive, so-called society.
It was an intriguing new role for a man whose youthful, hip-swinging exhibitionism was once branded too sexy for British TV.
Is that all right?
Come on, pretty baby, let's move it and groove it.
Cliff Richard was our first homegrown rock and roll hero and a teen idol of mine.
Yeah, I wanted to be you. You know, like,
oh,
fat chance of that.
Thank God you didn't make it.
No.
An irrepressible mainstay of British culture, he's the only artist to have had hit albums in 8 consecutive decades, selling 21 million UK singles along the way.
My band and I made the first real rock and roll record in Britain. Move It just took off. It just exploded.
Let me tell you, baby, it's called rock and roll.
Almost a year later, 1959, I had my first #1, Living Doll.
Got myself a crying, talking, sleep.
Suddenly, we've become rock and roll stars.
To do my best to please.
And our lives changed overnight.
It was very important for kids like me, actually, that this could happen in Britain was incredibly exhilarating for us.
Suddenly, we were followed by fans everywhere.
Yeah, the screaming.
It's hard to express it because it's so unexpected.
But in a move none of us saw coming, Sir Cliff rebelled in a very different way in 1964.
I felt that there was something missing.
Finding religion and becoming an evangelical Christian.
Before you actually, went public with becoming a committed Christian, I was wondering whether or not you were anxious about it being against the anything goes ethos of rock and roll or of the 60s generally.
I was aware that I was doing something that was a little bit dodgy for a pop singer to do, that this is not going to be easy.
Please join the queue on your right. Unreserved.
He kept his faith private until in 1966 he appeared at a rally held at Earl's Court in London, headlined by the massively popular American evangelist Billy Graham.
It's much bigger than Haringey, isn't it?
19,000 fervent Christians revealed a religious Britain often overlooked in the glam and glare of swinging Britain.
When Billy Graham was coming through, I'd been a Christian by that time for about 2 years. And I got this letter saying he's heard of my conversion and would I be prepared to sing and say something? And I said, okay, I'll come and do it.
You see, the human soul is so large that the world cannot fill it. All the popularity and all the money and all the sex experience, everything cannot fill your soul. Only God can fill it.
It was the most nerve-wracking because I knew now there were going to be press there. It was frightening to me to think, I'm going to say this thing, I'm going to sing.
Cliff, we're delighted to have you. Let's welcome him this evening as he comes.
And I chose the gospel song that I heard on Elvis's album.
It is no secret what God can do, what he's done for others, he'll do for you.
And I thought, oh my God, my arms. I couldn't bend my arms from touching the podium. That's how terrified I was to become publicly known.
Right.
And of course the press said, oh, Cliff's got God and he's got religion, and all that went on. But I got over that.
In fact, his conversion struck a chord with a great swathe of the public, increasingly and confidently vocal in their faith.
Do you think there's a religious revival taking place in Britain?
Definitely, yes.
What's the evidence?
Well, the evidence is going to be here tonight.
And united by their growing concerns around a permissive society.
This Manchester rally reaffirms the stand which Christians are taking against the rising tide of pornography.
It all came to a dramatic head in 1971 with the Festival of Light, a nationwide Christian protest against moral pollution.
Welling inside the British people is a desire to rebuild
the moral fibre of this country, which has been under attack. There's no doubt about that.
The festival was driven by Lord Longford, founder of the Pornography Commission, and other well-known Christian campaigners like Mary Whitehouse and the broadcaster Malcolm Muggeridge.
This is the light on our Festival of Light. Praise the Lord.
It culminated in a mass rally in Trafalgar Square and a concert in Hyde Park. The headline act, who else?
Help a poor boy who's hanging in the nowhere tree. Have you got a place to be?
How do you feel now about the Festival of Light, looking back on it?
I am not bothered about whether people read the Bible or don't read the Bible or have something that they found called the light or whatever it is.
Right.
All I know is that the thing that drew me to Christianity was the fact that all of it was based on love. I'm with people that don't seem to be immoral.
Right.
None of us are perfect. I'm happily not a judge anymore.
Right.
When I first started, I was a bit judgmental. You know, I thought this
About
is it.
what?
About the religion and my faith and everything. And then suddenly I remembered, no, this is you. I do not judge other people now.
Meanwhile, mainly on the perimeter, a certain amount of opposition was being offered by the forces of permissiveness under the banners of gay lib and women's lib and the like.
Yet at the time, there were those for whom some of the festival's rhetoric clashed with their own hard-won freedoms and belief in individual self-expression.
We had been out all day demonstrating against the Festival of Light.
And one photograph captured the tensions between progressive and conservative factions.
This is Hyde Park in September 1971. Suddenly, we found ourselves arrested. The police had just grabbed our arms from behind. You can see in the centre my friend Nicholas Bramble being violently pushed by the policeman. And there's me, you can see through the window of the police van. We were a group of feminist men within GLF, the Gay Liberation Front. We wanted to be seen as homosexuals on the street, so we decided the best thing to do is to wear drag and to be everybody else's, worst nightmare. What the Festival of Light people were saying made us angry. We weren't prepared to go back in time. All these demands that they were making, ideas that we were all perverted people. And then, of course, seeing us, it was like seeing a vision from hell as far as they were concerned. We were angry, but not so much at the people, but at the people who'd organised, who were behind it. These establishment figures manipulating people in their speeches made us feel that we were up against the moral majority.
So was liberation the midwife of a great British fragmentation, with clusters of the like-minded forming identity camps, assuming anyone not with them was bound to be against them? It was to head off these brushfires of mutual suspicion that something astonishing happened, out of all places, the BBC.
Community programmes which are made by viewers who've applied for airtime.
In a remarkable moment in broadcasting history, Sir David Attenborough, then the man in charge of BBC programmes, signed off on Open Door TV, an idea which was just that.
Voices, attitudes and opinions that, for one reason or another, have been unheard or that do not derive from the assumptions of the university-educated elite. People who have something to say.
I'm sick of this whole pretense that we are one big happy family.
It was a bold experiment in public access television, open to everyone, that allowed marginalised groups to speak directly to wider audiences.
So we ask you to resist the women's...
A precursor to our digital world of YouTube, social media and user-generated content.
The BBC would provide technical facilities, but play only a minimal part in editorial decisions.
Open Door TV, I think, wasn't just an extraordinary change in what broadcasting was supposed to be. It was really a kind of mini cultural revolution. The slogan of Open Door, your own say in your own way, says it all. It turned what broadcasting was, what it meant to everybody, completely upside down.
Of the four of us in the studio this evening, two are transsexuals awaiting sexual conversion surgery, and the other two, including myself, are what are known as sex changers.
The pioneering father of the BBC, Lord Reith, was always clear that to educate, inform and entertain meant abiding by certain rules of top-down propriety.
Did you consciously impose your own view of the world on the programmes and the practice of the BBC?
That's a leading question, isn't it? Yes.
Lord Reith wanted to pick people up, really, from the pub and the gutter and football grounds and wherever, and improve them. And Open Door was absolutely the opposite. It was television from the bottom up. It was saying we can have all voices, don't care what you sound like, don't care what you look like, don't care where you're from, we're going to give you the space. That was such a daring experiment. It was breathtaking.
We're a group of black teachers, and we made this program about the poor level of achievement of black children in the English school system. That's the problem that's worrying most of our black parents out there at this moment.
The feminine woman, and by that I mean a proper woman, has no wish to be manly, and she finds happiness and fulfillment through her femininity and natural female role, which the equality-obsessed fail to comprehend.
I think that a lot of husbands wouldn't batter their wives if they realised that their wives could get up and walk out.
Yeah.
A lot of men in our refuge have said to their wives, oh, you can't leave, there's nowhere for you to go.
When it comes to fighting racism, the media are part of the problem.
This is a typical example of the type of gardens you find in Asian areas.
Ever since I started a vegan diet, trying this and trying that, my health has steadily improved.
You had vegans, anarchists, feminists, anti-feminists, anti-racists, anti-immigrants, transsexuals, sci-fi UFO enthusiasts.
The Northern Unidentified Flying Object Network.
We start with a film of an unidentified flying object.
Chickens Lib learned the inside story of factory farming years ago.
Every single bit of organised, clubby, crusading, campaigning passion had a chance to be on air.
England is our country, and this is the flag of England, the proud flag of St. George.
We in Freedom Under Law think our society is too tolerant of protest groups which interfere with the freedom of other people.
A lot of the issues are, goodness knows, still with us today. They were not trivial. At some point in nearly all the programs, they make, really important statements that make us pause.
Jan, could you give the viewers some brief idea of the way you find life at the moment as a pre-op transsexual?
It's like living on the edge of a volcano.
Yes.
Because if anything happened to me, if I got knocked down by a bus or car or anything, or taken ill, and I was put into hospital, and they found out I was still biologically male, I would be put into a men's ward, which would be too embarrassing for words.
Yes.
Or if I wasn't put in a men's ward, I'd be put in a sort of side ward, and made to feel an oddity, whereas I feel I'm not an oddity.
Open Door ran for a decade from 1973, accommodating wildly different views in the belief that doing so wouldn't produce a destructive cacophony. But this was one episode on one screen once a week.
Open Door was made in an age of innocence, really, about how benign letting everybody have their own say would be, how healthy it would be for democracy. But you can't help, decades on in the age of the internet now, thinking about the following problem. The door is open, but opened for who?
The dawn of social media has seen a rise in antagonistic identity politics that make it increasingly difficult to find the nuance in one another's thinking.
Right now, we're in a situation where it's not discussion, it's screaming and shrieking and a kind of polemical madness that has overtaken. So I don't say Open Door wasn't responsible for that, but in some sense, it was a kind of harbinger of everybody stamping their feet.
A malicious online troll.
The dark side of social media and online.
Of trolling and fury. In Britain, we're on the verge of becoming an anarchy of the equally self-righteous. Knowledge and truth are under siege from people feeling entitled to say whatever the hell they like. You know, the sort of cultural conflict, which was a symptom of a healthy democracy, now threatens to actually tear it apart. We're in a different age.
So when the internet hustles us into our particular identity camp, there to pledge allegiance and plant our flag, it's harder than ever to think of ourselves as sharing a common national home. But if culture has any meaningful purpose at all, surely it is to help bring us together, however fleetingly, in spite of our differences. When I was a child, at a critical moment in the ruinous aftermath of World War II, the Festival of Britain did just that. And in 2012, in a rare recent moment of national togetherness, the Olympic opening ceremony in London treated us and almost 1 billion people watching worldwide to the unceremonious idea that being British wasn't just one thing, mechanically multiplied, but a gloriously creative chaos, a hectic explosion
Well, here comes Mary Poppins to save the
of
day.
uncontainable energy.
The Windrush, that's the ship that brought the first West Indian immigrants to Britain.
Artistic director Danny Boyle's Isles of Wonder, created with a crack team that included the children's book laureate Frank Cottrell Boyce, had something for almost everyone, defining the story of us through a moving sense of cultural connectedness.
Perhaps the most British thing about it is that people's expectations of it was so low. You know, this is going to be dreadful and we're all going to be very embarrassed.
Why do you think they said that? Because it's just a national habit.
Well, partly that's a national habit.
Yeah.
Eeyore is a very British figure.
Yeah.
And so the kind of ecstasy of its reception is the surprise that it was good. Danny's big watchword was visceral. He wants people having big reactions. It was to be moving, emotional.
They are producing something very special, forging a moment and an image that will live with us forever.
Most ceremonies for the Olympic Games always seem to be modelled on kind of military perfection. And this could not have been more different. You know, it's so culturally driven. Tell me what it was like to dream that up.
It was incredibly exciting at the beginning. None of us knew what we were doing because none of us had worked on an opening ceremony before. And there was no point asking the Chinese because their answer would be, send in the troops.
Beijing was extraordinary. Ours might be more modest, but it'll be just as spectacular, but maybe in different kinds of ways.
There was a washing line, which was our timeline, and we would pin things on the timeline as they came up. And I still remember Mark Tilsley, who's an incredible designer, coming in and hanging up the storyboard that he'd drawn for the Queen jumping out of a helicopter. And everybody else going, no, we can't do that.
My God, it worked.
Innovation comes from people who have the self-assurance to try stuff without knowing how it's going to turn out.
Looking back from this distance, there was not one particular exclusive vision of what Britain should be. I mean, every different kind of feeling British somehow cohabited merrily on that night. It seemed to deliver the distinctiveness of British culture.
Yeah, that was a key thing, that it would feel like a collage, that there would be all these things that coexisted in the same space, and things that perhaps contradict each other.
What sort of things contradicting each
like
other?
on a bigger picture, this is something that celebrated struggle. You know, the suffragettes, the Jarrow marches are in there, but it also celebrates royalty. The military, the NHS, that take of like just putting things alongside each other and seeing what happens between them, what the chemistry is.
Of all delectable islands, Neverland is the snuggest.
You didn't have to root for one side against another. That is Britain as well.
Stand by for pandemonium.
Bombs 3 and 5, Balloon Children. Go.
Good luck, everybody. Have a ball.
Powered by a cast of 10,000 volunteer performers. The ceremony generated a feel-good factor that for a short time at least invigorated these islands.
I think we knocked the spots off Beijing last night. I think it was a brilliant, brilliant opening ceremony.
Everyone's talking to each other, saying, where are you going, what have you got tickets for? It's just fantastic. I want to cry, actually. It's so good.
The thing that I found most moving about it is that culture at its best is just a pretext to bring people together. So I really love the fact that we did that for that moment.
What a night to be British.
But then there's this narrative that comes of like, wasn't everything great then? And everything was not great then. It wasn't paradise in 2012. That was the height of austerity, and the security issues around the Olympics were very controversial. And there was a tweet from an MP, I think his name's Aidan Burley, who said it was lefty multicultural crap. And that's a voice that's got louder. And maybe part of the glow around the opening ceremony is how much louder that voice has become in a way that it wasn't at all. It was for everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, the inventor of the World Wide Web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee.
At the time, This Is For Everyone was an explicit theme, in part a celebration of the British scientist who created the World Wide Web and made it available to all. And yet, over a decade on, even the ceremony has become a focus of toxic online conspiracies.
So the NHS sequence with the children in beds, there's a whole group of people for whom that is a pre-visualization of the plandemic. So the pandemic was a planned thing, and these big beds are an image of the Nightingale hospitals. And I do like children's book events where people will stop me and say, did you do that on purpose?
Okay, Frank.
It's become a site of disinformation itself.
Wow.
In this digital moment, we are constantly being siloed and batteried and divided. If there's something that can bring people together for an instant, it holds out that hope of proper peace between people and respect between people. And I think that's kind of what the real core of culture is.
I'm not so naive as to think that culture can fix everything that might be wrong with our country. But I do know this, that whatever does or doesn't work, one constant of our national life over centuries, and certainly now, is the bottomless creativity of our culture. Its capacity to surprise and shock and delight us. And if this country is to flourish in the future, it will be because we cherish and nourish that culture, so that when the next chapter in the story of us is written, it will absolutely be a cause for celebration.
Moonlight whispers love, stars above light the way. Holding you so close in the night we stay. Soft touch hearts collide in your eyes and streams. Hand in hand we glide, life's more than it seems. Endless nights with you. Every sky feels new. Love's our guiding light. Moments pure and true. hologram promises we keep endless nights with you. Every sky feels new. Love's our guiding light. Moments pure and true. Soft touch hearts collide in your eyes and dream. Hand in hand to glide, life's more than it seems. Endless nights with you. Every sky feels new. Love's our guiding light. Moments pure and true.
We live in divided times. An age of rising populism and tribal identity politics. But many of the arguments that divide us today have their origins decades ago. Since I was born in 1945, epic changes have marked our country. The end of empire,
The tide of Britain's imperial power has ebbed.
the dawn of mass immigration,
The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500
social and sexual revolutions, fierce battles over our land. Time and again, these transformations have made us ask, who are we now? We can't look for answers just in the speeches of politicians, the daily news cycle, and certainly not in the blare of social media. Rather, we should search where the beating heart of society truly lives, our common culture.
Culture is always upstream of politics. That's why culture matters.
It's the arts that have heralded dramatic changes in our lives.
It just made you think, oh yeah, we do exist, or we do count in some way.
Movies that bite back against convention.
Don't let the bastards grind you down, that's one thing I've learned.
Paintings that turn the tables on those who look and those who are looked at. Music, poetry, and fiction that cross tribal boundaries.
I'm often considered to be a funny kind of Englishman, new breed as it were.
In the most tumultuous times, our culture does more than merely capture the changing face of Britain. The arts connect us in rare and precious moments. Together, they tell us the complicated, gloriously contentious story of us. I come from a family of immigrants. Grandparents on both sides arrived in Britain at the turn of the 20th century, settling in London's East End. My mother Trudy, that's her with the fiendish curls, was born here in Whitechapel. My father Arthur, just round the corner in Stepney. Their generation were proud to be both British and Jewish.
My father left school when he was 14 years old. He led an Orthodox Jewish life, but he also recited enormous passages from Shakespeare off by heart. When we were growing up, he read Dickens out loud to us. It was synagogue on Saturday and Shakespeare on Sunday. And there was a day in 1953 when the whole family, and us kids in particular, felt especially happy in our Britishness. It was Coronation Day. The beautiful young Queen and her handsome prince were riding through London in a golden coach.
Crowds have waited for this moment.
Our neighbours came round for the telly.
As the golden coach appears in view for the first time.
And in the afternoon we had jellies, cakes and fancy dress. The eyes of the world were on us, and a lot of the world was with us.
The hours-long ceremony consecrating her as queen of all the nations and all the races over which she holds sovereignty.
It promised a new Elizabethan dawn, offering a carefully choreographed image of the British Empire, morphing anger and anguish free into the Commonwealth.
Men from all corners of the Commonwealth.
A frictionless evolution from ruling large swathes of the world to the Commonwealth's voluntary affiliation of equal, independent countries.
Men of all races and creeds, marching in honor of their Queen.
With the Queen at its head.
Many thousands of you came to London from all parts of the Commonwealth and Empire. I shall strive to be worthy of your trust.
The happiness of Coronation Day wasn't, in fact, just confined to the amazing day of June the 2nd, 1953. We all felt the afterglow. I was 8 years old, in school. We wanted that feeling of Britain as the kind of radiant new family. We were all going to grow up new Elizabethans. We wanted it to go on, and it did go on, because we had, in our classroom, an enormous map of the world, very much like this one, with a lot of it still painted, if not in bright red, then in becoming pink. And onto that map were little flags, were little Union Jack flags on the end of pins, and we planted them around the route that the Queen Duke of Edinburgh would take on their Commonwealth tour. And we followed them around the world.
The royal trip covered 44,000 miles and took in 13 countries across the West Indies, Australasia, Asia and Africa.
We also saw news footage of the Queen Duke of Edinburgh being applauded by exuberantly happy, joyous, loyal subjects. We all felt that the Commonwealth was genuinely a kind of harmonious club, completely unproblematic, made for the happiness of everyone involved.
But in reality, the change of life from Empire to Commonwealth in the wake of World War II would be far from anger and anguish free.
But British rule is on the defensive. In Kenya too, Britain's influence is challenged.
And with it came a profound identity crisis for many in Britain.
The tide of Britain's imperial power has ebbed. The British no longer rule the way.
Right from the start, not everyone had bought into the feel-good post-colonial Commonwealth. To some who'd played a part in the defeat of Germany and Japan, the Commonwealth was a consolation prize, not worth having.
This is the age of the anti-hero. All over the world, they're trying to sort of knock down the idols.
Ian Fleming, old Etonian and journalist, had been at the heart of naval intelligence during the war and was acidly unreconciled to a diminished Britain.
I think this personally is a great mistake because I've got many heroes in my life. People like Winston Churchill and people I've met during war.
If Britain no longer lauded it over much of the world, Fleming would invent a reincarnation of British exceptionalism.
Bond. James Bond.
I think that people like to read about heroes. Spying has always been regarded as a very romantic one-man job, so to speak, one man against the whole police force or an army.
Through Fleming, a one-man empire of British style with lethal good taste would fill the void of disappearing power.
It's fantastic to be in the presence of these beautiful first editions of Ian Fleming's James Bond novels. Because I think there have been so many Bond movies, and most people think about movies, they've forgotten the kind of extraordinary spell that these books cast. What the Bond books tell us, really, is someone who astonishingly caught the mood of Britain in the 50s. What did it mean to be British when you actually were rapidly losing the empire? They had a sense in which Britain still had a kind of heroic, adventurous, tough guy kind of role to play in the world.
James Bond was dreamt up in a colonial lair, the beachfront villa in Jamaica Fleming called Goldeneye. There, the empire lived on. Swimming against history, Fleming persisted with the colonial life, sundowners and loyal servants.
Jamaica exercises this extraordinary kind of hypnotic spell for Fleming. in Fleming's own mind, everything about it is sensuously pleasing, and the people are all absolutely obliging. So he's kind of living as if the sun had indeed never set on the empire.
The Jamaican, if he hears politics being talked on the radio, he's rather inclined to turn it off and get on to music, you know. He just doesn't really want anybody's politics.
Here's a bit of the kind of perfect imperial fantasy from Live and Let Die. Purple cover for a book which is full of purple prose.
In this passage, John Strangways, the British agent based in Jamaica, introduces Bond to the man who'll serve as his local guide as he prepares for his next mission.
After breakfast, Strangways appeared in the veranda with a tall, brown-skinned man in a faded blue shirt and old brown twill trousers. This was Quarrel, the Cayman Islander, and Bond liked him immediately. "Good morning, Captain," said Quarrel. Coming from the most famous race of seamen in the world, this was the highest title he knew, but there was no desire to please or humility in his voice. He was speaking as mate of the ship, and his manner was straightforward and candid. That moment defined their relationship. It remained that of a Scots laird with his head stalker. Authority was unspoken, and there was no room for servility. So that's Ian Fleming's ideal of the way things ought to be. People kind of knowing their place, honoring the authority of people like Commander Bond and Ian Fleming in naval intelligence. So it was, again, a kind of extraordinary sort of fantasy about natural rank.
It was a delusion that would not survive the shock of reality.
Within days, Port Said reeled under the attack of Anglo-French invasion forces intent on wresting control of the Suez from the Egyptian government.
In 1956, in response to the Egyptian nationalization of the Suez Canal, in a throw of the dice the shrewd gambler Bond would not have made, Britain and France, together with Israeli forces, invaded the canal zone. The gamble ended in a busted flush.
Russia also says no war.
When the fury of the United States and the Soviet Union forced an ignominious evacuation. Fleming put the derision of the world into the mouth of the Japanese spy master Taiga Tanaka in You Only Live Twice, sparking a telling exchange of hostilities with a tetchy Bond.
Bondo-san, you have not only lost a great empire, you've seemed almost anxious to throw it away with both hands. But when you apparently sought to arrest this slide into impotence at Suez, you succeeded only in stage managing one of the most pitiful bungles in the history of the world, if not the worst. And Bond comes back. Balls to you, Tiger, and balls again. Let me tell you this, my fine friend. England may have been bled pretty thin by a couple of world wars, and the liberation of our colonies may have gone too fast, but we still climb Everest and beat plenty of the world at plenty of sports and win Nobel Prizes. There's nothing wrong with the British people, although there are only 50 million of them. Yes. Black belt for Bond.
Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who'd presided over the Suez crisis, collapsed along with the expedition.
I'm deeply sorry to have to leave the country at this time. I'm going because the doctors say I must.
Amidst the ashes of this ridiculous and irresponsible and immoral kind of adventure, where does Anthony Eden fetch up? Answer, GoldenEye. The final decision of which Eden was capable, in other words, completing the evacuation from the Suez Canal, takes place at GoldenEye. So the end of empire happens in the house of the writer who wants the empire to live forever.
But Britain's epic embarrassment was catnip for the fortunes of James Bond and his author. Sensing the need for an antidote to humiliation, the unapologetically imperialist owner of the Daily Express, Lord Beaverbrook, serialized the new novel From Russia with Love. It was the perfect pick-me-up, and the escape-thirsty public drank deep.
This is a massive kind of compensation for all those things which seem to be missing for the vast majority of people. And then, really, the sales absolutely take off because of the serialization. He goes stratospheric, he becomes famous, and he never looks back.
Bond went global. 100 million colourfully written and jacketed books sold, a movie franchise birthed with Dr. No, spanning 25 films, an empire of fantasy fed from the remains of a real one.
Good evening, Mr. Bond.
An empire in which, unlike the original, the sun never set. Fleming's brother Peter would later reflect that Britain had lost an empire, yet all at once through Bond became reunited with the world. But the aftermath of Empire was a two-way journey. Ian Fleming might hide away from modern reality and his Caribbean make-believe. The West Indians were going in the opposite direction.
The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans. Many are ex-servicemen who know England, citizens of the British Empire coming to the mother country with good intent.
One ship at Tilbury Docks didn't come with a billboard saying, "Big historical moment." Britain needed labour, and hundreds of immigrants from the colonies showed up to provide it.
Now, why have you come to England? To seek a job.
They came where the work was.
Now, you're ex-Air Force, aren't you? Yes. Are you going back into the Air Force again? Yes.
The Nationality Act of that same year said anyone from the Empire could come, and many had earned that right through wartime service.
I'm also an ex-serviceman.
You're ex-service, RAF, are you?
RAF. I took a course in Scotland in case making, and I'm desirous of going back there to see if I can further, because I like it very much.
No big deal then. Only in hindsight can we see the arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948 as historically momentous, the start of something that would change what it means to be British. Right from the off came an unstoppable joy and confidence in their own culture. Aboard the Windrush were 3 Lords of Calypso, friends from Trinidad who toured the Caribbean together: Lords Beginner, Woodbine, and the most well-known, Lord Kitchener.
Now, may I ask you your name?
Lord Kitchener.
Lord Kitchener. Now, I'm told that you are really the king of Calypso singers, is that right?
Yes, that's
well, now, will you
true.
sing for us?
Right now.
Yes.
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia, or Australia, but you must come back to London City.
The music the newcomers brought with them was breezy with optimism.
Believe me, I am speaking broad-mindedly. I am glad to know my mother country.
It would be Caribbean sunshine, beamed onto rain-dark, pleasure-rationed Britain.
London, that's the place for me.
Any good calypso artist composes his own song. You do have the phony types that pretend to be good. But we're not speaking of them now. We're speaking about the true artists.
Are you born with this gift or what?
Well, I suppose you must be born with that gift.
Cricket, lovely cricket, at last where I saw it.
When the West Indies thrashed England at Lord's in the second test in 1950, the Caribbean crowd danced onto the field and through the streets of London to a calypso written by another of the Windrush immigrants, Lord Beginner.
At last where I saw it.
We kids all sang it too.
After all was said and done.
A vibrant new cultural energy was taking root. Calypsonian Lord Woodbine real name Harold Phillips, the youngest of the three lords who'd arrived together on the Windrush, formed one of Britain's earliest steel pan bands, who in the late 50s took up nightly residence at the Jacaranda Club in Liverpool.
Sometimes you've got to come to the place where something enormous happens in the life of British culture, and it's an incredibly important moment because actually some lads from around the corner called John Lennon and Paul McCartney and George Harrison come here. They hang out at the Jacaranda and they hear this fantastically alive music from a different part of the world, from the Caribbean, something that's totally its own kind of thing. And it switches something on. It's like the touching of wires.
Everybody hung around in this club called the Jacaranda, and that was the place in Liverpool, had these steel bands on and the rock bands. And so we started hanging around there before we were really formed the band, you know, when it was just me, Paul and George.
They were fascinated by the steel pan. John and Paul sometimes would get up and jam with the musicians. They just bounced off each other. My father, there was something special about him. You know, he was charismatic and funny. Lyrically, stuff would just roll off the top of his head.
They become friends with Lord Woodbine, the first songwriter they knew. He became a real mentor to them. The Beatles are known as Woodbine's boys. And it's really through him they get their first gigs.
This will be loud, watch out. So having drummed for years, since the old Lord Woodbine days.
Before the Cavern Club, this was the very first place the band performed under the name The Beatles.
And it happens right here at the Jacaranda. It's a fantastic moment.
And it was Lord Woodbine who helped the early Beatles get a residency in Hamburg, where they famously cut their musical teeth, changing their lives and the course of British music.
You see, the steel band went over and came back with this glorious news. Hamburg is this fab place you could play every night.
Love me do.
This is the only photo we have of Harold on this incredibly momentous trip to Hamburg. He's the reason, really, why they got the Hamburg gig. But here they all are, with the exception of John Lennon. He's in the van because he's a pacifist and this is a war memorial. It's a touching moment. They're kids made into musical men. He's absolutely a formative figure in what they become. It's a remarkable thing that this, Caribbean musician promoter is at the heart of the beginning of the Beatles' story. Harold and the thousands of people like him from the Windrush are part of the Caribbean community in Britain. They were fantastically essential for British culture. And a lot right now depends on who we think are at the heart of our story, of modern Britain.
It's a shame, it's unfair, but what can you do? The color of your skin makes it hard for you.
An angry crowd of youths chases a Negro into a greengrocer shop, while police reinforcements are called up to check the riot.
From the outset, the newcomers often faced extreme hostility. In Notting Hill, then an impoverished district of West London where many had settled, a fight in 1958 turned into a full-blown race riot. And Lord Kitchener, wondering if London really was the place for him, changed his tune.
Everything's all right if your skin is dark. No use you try, you got to suffer until you die.
This kind of prejudice has echoed right across my lifetime.
Personal stories caused by the Windrush scandal.
He couldn't prove he had the legal right to live here.
Institutional ignorance and thoughtlessness towards the history of the Windrush generation.
I think the Windrush generation fundamentally changed this country for the better. So the Windrush scandal fills me with sadness, anger, and regret, because there's so much that band of men and women brought to this country, and yet it was thrown back in their face. That's just shameful.
The Windrush scandal called into question the citizenship of tens of thousands of Caribbean immigrants. A result of the hostile environment policy, an aggressive clampdown on illegal immigration, first introduced in 2012.
It is not just about making the UK a more hostile place for illegal migrants. It is a bill that will make it easier for us to be able to remove people.
Illegal migration is an issue. There's no question about that. The problem was, at the same time, it scooped up people who were legally, rightfully allowed to be here. Denying people benefits, denying people access to the NHS, denying the right to life in this country. You needed to prove that you had a right to live here. And in order to do that, you needed to produce certain pieces of evidence for every single year you had been in this country. And that happened with my two older brothers, Lionel and Peter.
Although Clive was born in Bolton to Jamaican parents, his elder siblings were born in Jamaica, only rejoining the family here in the UK in the late 1960s, when his mother and father decided to settle permanently.
What was so appalling about it was that there was no suggestion when they first came here that this was going to happen. So there was no need to have proof or evidence, and they were freely invited into this country in the first place.
It's an ongoing crisis that stems from decades of rancorous political conflict around the question of immigration.
Racial harmony in Great Britain will benefit most if we cut the number of immigrants coming in now.
And various attempts to row back on commitments first made in that landmark piece of legislation from 1948 called the British Nationality Act.
Everyone was made a citizen, equal citizen across the empire. That not only meant that people could go to Britain, and a lot did from the Caribbean, and some from other parts of the empire, but it meant people could leave as well. A lot of Brits decided they were gonna leave. 2 million people. And that accentuated the problems that there were at the end of the war in finding a workforce to help rebuild this country. We just talk about all these black people coming here en masse. The Windrush generation, they come to sort of take our jobs and blah, blah, blah. They came to fill a skills shortage. And part of that was because so many Brits actually left.
While Winston Churchill described emigrants as rats leaving a sinking ship, Clement Attlee's Labour government, to introduce the Nationality Act, hadn't fully anticipated its impact.
What's interesting about 48 is that I don't think the Attlee government believed black people would be the people coming. I think they thought it would be Aussies and Kiwis and South Africans, Canadians. There was a blind spot to the possibility that black people would want to come and make their lives here.
Whatever our feelings, we cannot deny them entry. For all are British citizens and, as such, are entitled to the identical rights of any member of the empire.
If you sort of follow the trajectory of official government policy in relation to mass migration, from 48 all the way down to the 70s and 80s and the hostile environments policy, more and more people have voiced their anger and their concerns.
Those angry and anxious about immigration found an unlikely champion in the form of a classical scholar and poet.
We today are the heart of a vanished empire, amid the fragments of demolished glory, seem to find like one of our own oak trees standing and growing, the sap still rising from her ancient roots to meet the spring, England herself. Our generation is one which comes home again from years of distant wandering. We discover affinities with earlier generations of English who felt no country but this to be their own. For the unbroken life of the English nation over 1,000 years and more is a phenomenon unique in history.
Freedom!
This hymn of praise of England, everybody come together in our shared common memory, were the words of somebody who became notorious for being one of the most divisive politicians in our history. Enoch Powell. Powell wrote poetry. He was no dope. He was a professor of classics at Sydney University, and he was 25. In classical education, rhetoric comes first. He is this sort of master of the art form of rhetorical persuasion. And he has this extraordinary kind of augmented lyrical view of the absolute uniqueness of the English past, a sense of pride in the inheritance of being English.
12th century up to the short of a top story, and this perpendicular window is late 14th, early 15th century.
And he was doing this for a very particular moment and very particular reason.
Powell's words are from an address delivered to a private dinner on St. George's Day in 1961. It was less a speech than a prophetic oration, a summons to a new patriotism that would heal the wound left by the loss of empire. The cause burned hot inside Powell, because while stationed in India during the war, he'd fantasized about one day becoming viceroy.
An era has ended. Independence Day for India. A new epoch.
With whatever chagrin, he adjusted to bitter reality.
The imperial moment had gone. The compensation was that we can recover what always made us great before we went off on this madcap imperial adventure. We can come back to the oak trees. We can come back to old England.
But Powell's mystical reverence for a shared historical communion of national memory, custom and kinship was being delivered against the backdrop of a rapidly changing nation.
Once he's living inside this imperishable, lyrically expressed notion of what old merry England is, then there are the aliens, you know, who somehow have been allowed to believe that they share it, whereas they don't. They have no organic psychological connection to that past. And they will essentially invade you and conquer you, and then it'll all be over. He always kept on saying, I speak for the ordinary people who don't know what's hit them, who suddenly are feel they're living in a foreign country. Did he have a very shrewd intuition? He sure did. And he really connects with the wiring that millions of people in Britain actually feel.
We must be mad, literally mad as a nation, to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents who are, for the most part, the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population.
When Powell delivered his infamous Rivers of Blood speech 7 years later in 1968, immigration numbers were rising, as was prejudice against non-whites.
I can't let you in. I've got 14 English boys in here.
A new Race Relations Act before Parliament would make it an offence to deny housing or a job on grounds of race, a move Powell believed discriminated against the native population.
To enact legislation of the kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto gunpowder.
In fact, it was the alarmist tone of his oratory, studied with quotes from his constituents, that would ignite and divide the nation.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
But not all of the speech was filmed. Missing was its most apocalyptic line, quoting the classical poet Virgil. As I look ahead, Powell concluded, I'm filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood.
I told Mr. Powell that he could not remain a member of the Shadow Cabinet because of the inflammatory nature of his speech at Birmingham, causing, I believe, grave damage to race relations.
He'd lost his place on the Conservative front bench, but every day saw yet another bulging sack of letters singing his praises. 100 to 1 in support, they offer insights into the concerns and frustrations of the many who rally behind him. Dear Mr. Powell, thank you for saying what I'm sure most of us are thinking. I admire your guts. Britain is backing you. Your speech was magnificent. Immigration must, capital letters, be stopped now, double underlined. There are 100,000 letters. He has his finger on the pulse of the fears of people all over the country. It's a kind of national breakdown. Our country is quickly heading for ruin. Why should we have to become a multiracial society? We are now an occupied country. Their response is awful, but Powell is quite right. It's enormously widespread through the population.
88% of Slough people say they support Enoch Powell. 88% Slough people.
They do feel that they've been put into a corner, really, that they don't know their own towns any longer. Though far fewer, there were 800 letters expressing an altogether different kind of anger. Although it's now obvious you can claim much support, this is not to say you're right or that your outburst can do anything but harm yours in disgust. Your conceit has allowed you to make a frivolous and irresponsible speech which threatens to unleash brutal instincts reminiscent of the early 1930s in Germany.
Yourself, you slaves! You're a decent white man amongst you!
Powell has warned that there will be race violence. There'll be literally blood on the streets, River Tiber foaming with blood, if this is not stopped. The extreme right wing would have taken heart from having someone who comes from the center of the political establishment. They would have taken courage from the rivers of blood. And it kind of injected this pathogen into the cultural and political life of the country. Absolutely not gone away. Absolutely not gone away.
My country! Let's have it!
The way it did unfold was terrible kind of violence. The kind of excited aggression of skinheads and white nationalists to sort of kick off real bloody awful trouble in the industrial heartland.
You've done too much, much too young. You're married with a kid when you could be having fun with me.
For those who were appalled by Powell and what the white nationalists stood for, Britain could be a place of defiant, multiracial creativity. An idea embodied by the Coventry band, The Specials, and their two-tone revolution. The brainchild of visionary artist Jerry Dammers.
This was a Vox Continental, which was what we went on the road with originally around the first album. A lot of them got stolen in Coventry. The original did turn up on the internet. This guy, he got in touch with me.
So he was blackmailing, basically extorting.
Yeah.
I hope you told him to sod off.
No, but I wanted to get it off. I said I'd give him the going price, but then he realised it was worth a lot more, so he disappeared. When the special started, it was a total concept. The idea of it was to take the message to the people who were vulnerable to being recruited by the National Front, the British movement, right. All that racism. This was something that everybody could relate to.
I'm going out tonight. I don't know if I'll be all right.
The Specials were part of a wider Rock Against Racism movement at a time when support for far-right groups on the street and at the ballot box was rapidly increasing.
A band like us, which had black people and white people in, was kind of unusual, to put it mildly. I wanted it to be a mixture, and that tied in with my politics and, you know, the whole black and white, unite and fight.
But Two-Tone was not just about black and white musicians performing together in the same band. It was a musical fusion, the rhythm and melody lines of Jamaican ska, the next wave of Caribbean music after Calypso, juiced up with punk rawness and bite. A coming together across the lines, skinhead aggression channeled into charged fun, a genuinely alternative message for their audiences.
Stop you messing around.
The message is a message to all the roadies, you know? It's not worth getting into trouble. So it's a message to all the kids who go and cause trouble.
The original idea for the band, everything was very tribal at that time. There were punks and teddy boys and rockabillys and skinheads and mods. And you know, my idea was always unity. You know, there would be one person representing all these different tribes, you know.
Stop you fooling
All second-hand gear, very nice too. Nice piece of mohair. We're in the pub next minute, we're #1 on Top of the Pops.
First of all, I like the music. Believe in all they're trying to do. You know, unite the blacks and whites and what like that. The Coventry group, that's something to be proud of, you know, sort of thing.
But despite the Specials and other bands signed to their Two-Tone label enjoying unexpected hits, their hometown, Coventry, was fast becoming one of the ugliest theatres of race violence in the whole country.
I think the message of Two-Tone got through to the vast majority of kids, but of course there were some that it didn't get through to, and it was very depressing to me that some of those were in Coventry, our hometown.
Coventry is a very important centre of engineering.
This city has grown faster in numbers than any other city in the country.
It's a car-making city which has seen better days.
Racism, unemployment and urban deprivation have undoubtedly played a part.
This is England. This is our country, no one else's.
Tensions that are threatening a once prosperous city, and the shock caused by the killing of one young man.
In April 1981, a 20-year-old Sikh student, Satnam Singh Gill, was stabbed in broad daylight in a shopping precinct for the crime of having a white girlfriend.
2 white youths have been charged with murder.
For the Sikh community in Coventry and beyond, this was a horrifying trauma. One of many at the time.
The events in Coventry were absolutely horrific. Satnam Singh Gill murdered, Dr. Darry murdered, 20 yards from my front door in the chip shop. We felt that we had to do something.
Against a backdrop of awful, terrible things in Coventry, the Specials put on their peaceful protest against racism right here.
What do we
This was a neighborhood festival of how things could be better with music. The turnout wasn't great, but the fact was phenomenal. You know, it's a moment of joy. And very brave, very, very brave.
There's this rumour going around that the National Front were going to organise a march, you know, what, in favour of murder, you know, it's like that is how pathetic they were. For the people who were there, it was a fantastic event, really good mix of black and white.
That's a case where, you know, art and music can make a difference.
Yeah, it was tough, but we had to do something.
In the weeks following the stadium gig, an edgy, eerie song Jerry had written would catch, with pitch-perfect tone, the dark national mood. Riots had exploded on the streets of Brixton in April 1981, and that summer spread across the country.
Police would no longer be able to contain the riot.
The uncontrolled fury. Cars and vans were overturned and set.
And the specials Ghost Town seemed like prophecy and punk lament. Let's talk about Ghost Town.
Well, when we were on tour, we saw, you know, the results of recession. We saw shops boarded up in Liverpool. In Glasgow, we saw people out on the streets just sort of selling whatever they had. You could tell that something was not right.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth.
This town is coming like a ghost town. All the clubs are being closed down.
Thatcher was busy closing down industry. Eventually it got to 3 million people on the dole.
Bands won't play no more. Too much fighting on the dance floor.
Police provocation, you understand? It's been coming for a long time.
There was a lot of resentment between black people and the police. You know, black youth were prepared to stand up and say they wouldn't take any more of this.
This very dark, slightly mad, unbelievably affecting, haunting song climbs and climbs and climbs till it's #1 for 3 weeks. And there's this kind of elegy feeling to it. You know, Boomtown to Ghost Town. It's an extraordinary moment, really, and an astonishing sense of absolutely being in key with the times. So disaster and crisis generates something that really is a genuine work of art. Complicated, powerful, passionate, affecting, something that gets into your head. The perfect match, really, between music and the moment. Seizing the moment, too, were thrilling new literary voices across theatre, film and the novel, exploring with witty irreverence their own place and experiences in the minefield of multicultural Britain.
My name is Karim Amir, and I'm an Englishman born and bred. Almost. That comma and the almost is the defining mark of the children of first-generation immigrants.
Hanif Qureshi, one of our most gifted and bracingly original novelists and screenwriters, was born and grew up in Bromley, South London, to a Pakistani Muslim father and a white working-class mother.
I'm often considered to be a funny kind of Englishman, a new breed, as it were, having emerged from 2 old histories. But I don't care. Englishman I am, though not proud of it, from the South London suburbs and going somewhere. Perhaps it's the odd mixture of continents and blood, of here and there, of belonging and not, that makes me restless and easily bored. What you want to do as a writer, you want to find a subject that enables you as a writer to do your best work. But you also want to find a material or a subject that other people aren't dealing with. We were first generation, I guess, of mixed-raced kids. So when I began to write seriously, the field was really open for writers like me because this subject, which was race, racism, the new demographic of the UK, had hardly been tackled.
What's amazing about your writing is that it's so funny, you know.
But I grew up on comedy. I grew up on watching, you know, British sitcoms. Steptoe Son. I mean, that is Beckett on television.
You'll be stuck on a stud farm with a rosette behind your ear hole.
I don't think I'd ever wanted to write a line that didn't have a spin or a twist from a comedic point of view.
Hanif's breakout moment arrived in 1985, when his subversive screenplay, My Beautiful Laundrette, became a hit film.
It's nothing but a toilet and a youth club, a constant boil on my bum.
I'd written My Beautiful Laundrette in around 83, 84. Yeah. It's a love story about Thatcherism. You can't say fairer than that for entertainment.
All right, get started. There's the broom. Move it.
I don't only want to sweep up.
Oh, what are you, Labour Party?
I want to be manager of this place. I think I can do it. Please let me.
It was in part a story drawn from Hanif's own youth, exploring the complex relationship between two young men, school friends estranged,
I'm dead impressed by all this.
when one becomes a fascist thug.
You were the one at school, the one they liked.
All the paggies like me.
I mean, even as we're talking about, you know, the richness of comedy, that was a scary time, really.
There was a lot of National Front activity. And it was really the influence of Enoch Powell.
Yeah.
And I remember going to a girl's house and her father chasing me away, and indeed setting his dog on me, shouting, "We're with Enoch." You know, he was a great inspirer of skinhead life. And I remember one day, one of my friends came round, as it were, to play, and he was dressed entirely in the skinhead gear. And I remember thinking how weird that was, because my father, when he came home from work on the train, was always nervous at the station because the skinheads gathered around looking for fights. And so we lived in fear of my dad being pursued and beaten and kicked around. And yet my school friends were becoming skinheads. And of course, they would say, you know, "We're not after you, Hanif. You know, you're one of us." And when I came to write My Beautiful Laundrette, that really stayed with me.
There ain't nothing I can say to make it up to you. There's only things I can do to show you that I am with you.
So the relationship, the gay, loving, romantic relationship between Daniel Day-Lewis and Gordon Warnack really came out of those kinds of incidents.
It seems that the England that I inhabit hadn't been portrayed on the screen. Nobody's written a film about two gay men who run a laundrette, you know, before.
There aren't many.
Why hasn't it been done? I've got to do that.
The nominees for Best Screenplay written directly for the screen.
And the big thing was that it was released in the US, where it was also a big hit and took a lot of money.
Hanif Qureshi for My Beautiful Laundrette.
Hanif's transatlantic success showed that multicultural Britain was not doomed, as Enoch Powell had predicted, but remaking itself anew. Yet having experienced firsthand the violence of far-right nationalists, Hanif was also one of the earliest writers to confront the rise of Islamic fundamentalism among a small minority in the UK.
The tempo of protest over Salman Rushdie is rising.
Rushdie was a friend of mine, a fellow writer, and I was horrified by the fact that, you know, in the north of England, they were burning a book. I got really interested in why all these young Asian people, why they were not liberals. Because you'd imagine that their parents had come to the UK in order to enjoy, let's say, the so-called liberalism of the UK. And so I started to write my novel, The Black Album, and of course the movie, My Son the Fanatic, about kids who were creating a new identity, I guess, called Muslim.
In the end, our cultures, they cannot be mixed.
Everything is mingling already together, this thing and the other.
Some of us are wanting something more besides muddle.
What?
Belief, purity, belonging to the past. I won't bring up my children in this country.
I mean, we'd never called ourselves Muslims before. It was a new word. Nobody ever defined themselves by their religion. It was a very modern idea, that. And it really came out of, you know, post-colonial rage, really.
Remember two things. There are many ways of being a good man. And I will be at home. Will you come and see me?
Multiculturalism does rely on one thing, which is this idea of liberalism, and always assumes a compromise as well. If you go to an extreme, then multiculturalism dies. One place you might think that liberalism had planted a flag was the British election, but it was instantly followed by race riots. Did that surprise you? It would, I think, surprise me more if racism ever went away. But I would say, on the whole, overall, Britain's done a pretty good job. Most of us get along with our neighbours without killing one another most of the time. How much do you think all these conflicts and difficulties have generated cultural energy? If anybody asked me, why I would call myself a proud Britisher, I would say it's to do with culture. We're really, really good at this stuff. Culture and the arts is not going to solve anything. That would be ridiculous, but it is a very good place where we can talk about what matters to us, what's important to us, is really crucial and really what's beautiful about this country.
Although our backgrounds are very different, much like Hanif, I've always felt proudly British on the strength of our shared culture, an appreciation for this nation's open-mindedness, something born of my parents' experience here in the East End.
My mother and father always felt that East London, even though it was overwhelmingly Jewish, was a kind of tolerant place, really. They thought they'd been dealt the best possible deck of cards by landing in Britain, and that you could find a home in Britain that was not tribally paranoid or nervous. The East End then was a kind of exhilaration of ethnic chaos. There was a big Irish population, an Italian population as well. Later on, my mum knew the leaders of the Bangladeshi Muslim community. There's this kind of organic feeling that immigrant culture gave you, not a kind of terrifying battle to be fought, but another lease of life, another lease of life. That was, and they passed that on to me, really. The flowering of culture is not a zero-sum game. You look at politics around the world and you despair. People are actually taught to fear the other culture. And then the damage starts. I still have the sense of Britain as a mansion of multitudes. You can have your arguments, but you don't want to live separately, and you don't want to live in a kind of time where you're shaking your fist over the garden fence at your neighbor. You try and bring passionate feelings on both sides into the same discussion. And culture is very good at that. Britain is a place, ultimately, call me a kind of dopey utopian, where you have the gift of immigration, you have the gift of lots of different cultures. Mr. Sunshine, it's me.
Moonlight whispers of stars above, light the way, holding you so close in the night we stay. Soft touch hearts collide in your eyes and the streams. Hand in hand we glide, life's more than it seems. And as wanna die. Promises we keep. Endless nights with you. Every sky feels new. Love's our guiding light. Moments pure and true. Soft touch hearts collide in your eyes and dreams. Hand in hand we glide, life's more than it seems. Endless nights with you. Every sky feels new. Love's our guiding light. Moments pure and true.
Times. An age of rising populism and tribal identity politics. But many of the arguments that divide us today had their origins decades ago. Since I was born in 1945, epic changes have marked our country. The end of empire,
The tide of Britain's imperial power has ebbed.
the dawn of mass immigration,
The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 domains.
social and sexual revolutions, fierce battles over our land. Time and again, these transformations have made us ask, who are we now? We can't look for answers just in the speeches of politicians, the daily news cycle, and certainly not in the blare of social media. Rather, we should search where the beating heart of a society truly lives, our common culture.
Culture's always upstream of politics. That's why culture matters.
It's the arts that have heralded dramatic changes in our lives.
It just made me think, oh yeah, we do exist, or we do count in some way.
Movies that bite back against convention.
Don't let the bastards grind you down. That's one thing I've learned.
Paintings that turn the tables on those who look and those who are looked at. Music, poetry, and fiction that cross tribal boundaries.
I'm often considered to be a funny kind of Englishman, a new breed, as it were.
In the most tumultuous times, our culture does more than merely capture the changing face of Britain. The arts connect us in rare and precious moments. Together, they tell us the complicated, gloriously contentious story of us. In 1972, the poet Philip Larkin wrote a dark prophecy about the future of the British countryside.
I thought it would last my time. The sense that beyond the town there would always be fields and farms, where the village louts could climb such trees as were not cut down. I knew there'd be false alarms in the papers about old streets and split-level shopping, but some have always been left so far. And when the old part retreats, as the bleak high-risers come, we can always escape in the car.
The story it tells is one I recognize from my own lifetime, of the rapid transformation of Britain and nature's struggle to keep up.
Things are tougher than we are. Just as Earth will always respond, however we mess it about, chuck filth in the sea if you must, the tides will be clean beyond. What do I feel now? Doubt? Or age, simply? The crowd is young in the M1 cafe. Their kids are screaming for more. More houses, more parking allowed, more caravan sites, more pay. Well, Larkin didn't really think very much of his poem. He called it thin, ranting, conventional gruel. But I absolutely love it. I think it's one of my favourite poems, probably because in my, long lifetime, Britain's really been transformed. So much has happened, rising population, ribbons of motorways. When I was growing up, there was just one motorway. Catastrophic loss of species. But there's also such a perfect match between the man who's writing it and the subject, which is that anxiety about the perishing of the English landscape she loves so much.
Everything I write, I think, has the consciousness of approaching death. What one writes is based so much on the kind of person one is that one doesn't really choose the poetry one writes. One writes the kind of poetry one has to write.
As usual with Larkin, it's melancholy, and there is something of the grumpy old geezer about it. But it is actually about something that was really important for his generation, the sense that eternal England, the gorgeousness of the countryside, and everything about it was under siege, really, from the kind of grasping quality of Philistine economic growth.
From his hometown of Hull, Larkin witnessed firsthand the unsettling pace of change and voiced what so many people across Britain were feeling.
It seems just now to be happening so very fast. Despite all the land left free, for the first time I feel somehow that it isn't going to last. That before I snuff it, the whole boiling will be bricked in, except for the tourist parts. And I think the reason why he felt so kind of deeply about it was because he thought that to be English was somehow to feel that strongly about all the kind of beauty of the countryside. And the sort of sense of, because so many of us love it so much, is the one thing that really unites us all. I think back to my mum and dad's generation and me actually growing up as a kid after the war. You think, what is it we fought for? And you have a vision of kind of all of this. This is Britain. And when I fly into England, this is daft, I know. When I fly into England and there's that patchwork quilt, I feel deeply and profoundly moved. So the poem is actually a kind of drama of what's going to happen to the country. And that will be England gone. The shadows, the meadows, the lanes, the guild halls, the carved choirs. There'll be books. It'll linger on in galleries. But all that remains for us will be concrete and tires. Read it today, it seems so prescient. We're still talking about traffic and crap being thrown into the sea. I mean, just in 2023, there were more than 800 incidents of sewage spills in the Humber behind me. You take the poem on board and it can read like a kind of rightly indignant and worried opinion piece from one of last Sunday's newspapers. But it's much, much more powerful because only culture and poetry can actually pack that kind of tragic punch.
For 11 days in June 1972, Stockholm was a magnet for everyone concerned with the environment.
Larkin's poem was conceived at the exact moment when Britain and the world were waking up to the environmental cost of progress.
1,200 official delegates from 113 nations were in Stockholm for the first international conference on the human environment.
If you happened to be in Stockholm in June 1972 and you were a British delegate, you would have in your briefcase this publication of Her Majesty's Stationery Office, an official document of the government, which, despite this amazing photograph of a young woman with virtually nothing on, rising out of a misty pond. I mean, it's this kind of naughtiest photograph for the, the pinstripe delegates to have in their suitcases. But inside this document was, extraordinarily, Philip Larkin's poem.
The report had been masterminded by glamorous socialite, the Countess of Dartmouth, to help inform the government's environmental position.
We were optimistic and we thought that we could achieve what many other people have failed to do.
The risque cover was her idea, as was the decision to commission Larkin to write the poem as a prologue, an inspired move to co-opt the power of art to rouse Britain's delegates.
Our science and our wisdom are coming together, and our faith and our reality are beginning to coincide.
But there was one verse of Larkin's poem that the delegates never got to read, one that had triggered consternation in Whitehall, and which Larkin was ordered to purge from the final text because it laid bare an inconvenient truth.
On the business page, a score of spectacled grins approve some takeover bid that entails 5% profit and 10% more in the estuaries. Move your works to the unspoilt dales, grey area grants.
The verse was just too close to the bone, because it exposed the fact that the needs of prosperity might often be at odds with the preservation of our green and pleasant land.
Amazingly, Larkin actually agreed to change his poem, but he said the result made my flesh creep. So he wrote to Dartmouth, and he said, well, this seems to me to put the blame on everybody else, except the people really responsible, the spectacled grins who are out there for a kind of cheap killing and who would be completely reckless in their disregard for the environment. And sure enough, when he republished it and gave it the new title of Going, Going, as with an auctioneer's hammer, he restored the original bits of the poem. You know, we think of him as kind of grumpy, curmudgeon, not really a political animal, but in this particular moment, he's kind of an eco-warrior. He's got a kind of passion, he's got a cause to fight. So out of that comes this fantastic bringing together of England in peril and the forces of modern attack that are endangering its beauty and everything that we feel so deeply that makes the country home.
It's no accident that when people talk about where they're from, they use a word drawn from nature: roots. Belonging to a land means holding a landscape dear, and Larkin is part of a long tradition of inspired British artists who've instilled this idyllic vision of rural beauty at the heart of our national sense of self. Today, 85% of us live in cities, and that idyllic vision still holds a tight grip on our collective imagination. Whether it's our online yearnings, appetite for period dramas,
Mr. Darcy?
and affection for the National Trust. For many of us, the countryside remains a bastion of continuity in a rapidly changing world. But in fact, the British landscape is a theatre of enormous argument and conflict. And just as often, the best art strips away feel-good fantasies and gives us a stiff reality check. Joanne Coates is a farm labourer in the North Yorkshire Dales. She's also an award-winning photographer, and in 2024 was appointed by Parliament as the official election artist.
My role as an artist is to share the stories that we really don't think of when we look at a beautiful landscape. The Dales especially are kind of seen as this really picturesque ideal kind of chocolate box place, but actually there's this tension and friction here. And I think the countryside is seen as this theme park, you know, somewhere to kind of come and get away from it all. But for most people who live here now, this version of the countryside just isn't reality.
Joanne's work introduces notes of disquiet into the picture postcard landscape.
In my work, I guess, there's this quiet rage that I have. I really want to provide this anti-idyll, this different version of the countryside that's usually seen through a middle-class lens.
Through her art, Joanne explores the issues facing many born and raised in rural areas.
Today, there's a huge surge of second homes or Airbnbs, and what is affordable to someone maybe from a city isn't affordable to someone from here. At the same time, there's a real lack of social housing, and people want more housing to be built. But the people who don't want them to be built are usually the people who've moved here and who want to keep the status quo of that beautiful version of the countryside. I worked with Anita, and Anita was from up the roads from Midland, and she lived in social housing most of her life, and access to that has kind of slowly become more difficult. So she's had to move away. What Anita was talking about was having that real lack of hope that she could have a future here again. So people are going to feel kind of forced out of where they're from. It's a really difficult situation, and I think you're seeing it in Cornwall, in North Wales, in the Highlands. I guess if you're coming on holiday, you probably don't want there to be anything because it's like lovely and empty. But the less people there are in a village, you see the school close, the post office close, and it's slowly, it disintegrates and there's nothing left. My fear is the countryside is not going to be a place where people can live and work. I think that the image of it is ultimately all about power, wealth, status and control. And what does that mean for the future of this place?
Romanticism can be a dangerous deception, but sometimes it's impossible not to be seduced.
This is almost preposterously beautiful, with the kind of light of God shining directly on the loch. This is the kind of extraordinary sort of fever dream, gorgeous version of the Scottish Highlands, which draws endless movie producers and swooning poets to it. And, you know, you look down there and you think, you know, scenery doesn't get more beautiful than this. It's a fantasy geography, really. And the way it lives in the popular imagination is a kind of dream.
The Scottish Highlands were once a neglected landscape on the distant fringes of the British Isles.
But all that changed in the 19th century, when the romantic imagination turned the Highlands into a place of escape and wild adventure. This became a land of enchantment that entranced millions, including Queen Victoria, who created her own Highland fantasy at Balmoral. Inaugurating a fashion for transforming moors and glens into a gigantic playground for the wealthy. But that romantic vision of the Highlands hid a painful history, which, starting in the middle of the 18th century, saw hundreds of thousands of crofters forced from the land through a combination of poverty and eviction by landowners intent on monetizing their property by replacing people with more profitable sheep. So this is a landscape of grief and anger and tragedy. But what Britain and the rest of the world sees is tartan joy and the sound of bagpipes.
It's Friday, another day in a whistle-stop tour, an experiment in political theatre which has taken the Highlands of Scotland by storm.
That vision of tartan joy and bagpipes was to be shattered by a radical theatre group.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Fescer McGive. Welcome to the Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil.
In 1973, a groundbreaking show travelled to the isolated communities of the Scottish Highlands.
And tonight, we're going to be telling a story that has a beginning, a middle, but as yet, no end.
The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil gave the audience a raucous and satirical romp through their history. But the aim of its socialist playwright John McGrath could not have been more serious.
It's off, left, right, shooting stags, my dear, and Christ. And if the locals should complain, well, we can clear them all again. We'll clear the straws, we'll clear the beds.
The intention was no less than a political awakening, telling the people a tragic story of how not only their land had been appropriated, but their traditions too.
Oh yes, she's a great interest in Highland culture. How I wish that I could.
Some bits were like poison darts, really. You know, that broad comedy parodying the English toffs who suddenly fasten a kilt on, and then they delude themselves that they're really leading the Scottish life, and I love that.
But although we think you're quaint, don't forget to pay your rent. And if you should want your land, we'll cut off your grasping hand.
It's fantastic, and the sketch kind of builds up to this ferocity.
You're a low and servile race. We clear the straw. We clear the path. We clear the bell. We need no more. We'll show you where the rolling
It's a brilliant piece of theatre. Very, very funny and deeply sinister at the same time. It becomes kind of a reminder of immense battles and catastrophes in Scottish history at the hands of the English, but also at the hands of lowlanders as well. And you saw the audience, more importantly. They were moved by what they were hearing. The power of the play came from the fact that it was the opposite of high theatre and travelled to the very places where the history it told had happened. The company was called 784, after the statistic that 7% of the people in Britain owned 84% of the wealth. Their humble show became an unexpected sensation,
playing to over 30,000 people in over 100 communities across the Highlands and Islands. One of their stops was the village of Dorney, where they played in this community hall that stands modestly across the loch from the dream vision of the Highlands that 784 was busy tearing down. Among the cast was renowned Scottish actor and folk legend, Delina MacLennan.
It was very emotional. It was an emotional trip for me every night, and feeling the people's reaction. And that's still with me and brings tears to my eyes quite often. I mean, it was huge. Yeah. People were expected us, and they were excited at us coming. The word went round. People from the cities travelled to the village halls because they had heard that the difference of feeling that you got in a village hall that you couldn't get in a big theatre.
Obviously, you tapped into something. They were obviously hungry in a way. They were waiting for something like this.
That's exactly it. It seemed they were waiting for something.
As the rain on the hillside comes in from the sea, all the blessings of life fall in.
It was community spirit that was exemplified in Dorney Hall that night. My parents were there, my sisters were there. We knew everybody, or most people, there.
Over the course of the evening, Ian and the rest of the audience saw a version of their history that chimed with their own folk memories.
As a family, we suffered hugely from a lot of the things in the Chivi at the Stag. The Highland clearances. My father worked on an estate, and I was an engineer at the very start of the oil. And the play did raise the hackles of people because it made people more aware of what had happened and how things haven't really changed.
Because it finishes with the oil and what it was going to do for Scotland.
Hell of a lot of American money, honey.
We didn't see very much of it. Of course, it all went south and sold to multinationals with the connivance of the Scottish people and Westminster.
Take your oil rig by the score, drill a little well just a little offshore. Pipe that oil in from the sea and pipe these profits home to me. I'll bring work that's hard.
I think that was the most powerful part of the play.
17, 18, 19, 20, you'll get nothing, I'll get plenty. 21, 22, 23, 24 billion dollars more. 25, 26, 27, 28, watch that cash accumulate. 27, 28, 29, 30, you play dumb, I'll play dirty. I'll go home and as see fit, all that leaves a heap of shit. You dumb fools, I'm rooking you. You'll find out in a year or two.
I think the audience were totally shocked by that, and the fact that everybody thought, well, wait a minute, this is so true.
Just a little fooling around.
The reaction of the audience was intense, I think it's the word. Yeah. You can actually see the faces of the people changing from smiles to, you know, absolutely horror, absolute horror.
At the end, there was just a feeling amongst people, we should be doing something about this.
In the wake of the play, the Scottish National Party echoed some of its themes in a campaign promising to take back control of Scotland's resources, and achieved a breakthrough result at the 1974 general election.
Well, now let's go to Scotland, where Winifred Ewing is successful in Marianne.
We are here with a specific mandate. Scotland's raw deal is behind our success.
Battle lines were being drawn about who should decide the fate of Scotland's land and resources. And that's a question that still reverberates to this day.
It's inconceivable that it didn't have this massive sense of Scots thinking about how Scots wanted to live their life. Great art and great culture really should absolutely, as this absolutely does, open questions, open reflections, open debates, excite the sympathies and the passions. It had an enormous impact, well beyond the kind of handmade quality of a troupe of strolling players.
I'm still amazed when people come up to me and say, "You don't know me, but you changed my life." And so many people still talk about the impression it made on them 50 years later.
No land in the UK has been as riven with conflict as Northern Ireland. And when people are dying, what use is art? At the height of the Troubles, the Irish poet Seamus Heaney experienced the devastation firsthand.
I mean, here at the minute you're sitting in your house and literally the windows rattle every day, every night, with explosions from one side of the town or the other. You're living where men are killed blandly by the army, brutally by bombs. And what do? You're sitting, putting marks on paper, the same as you were doing before this started.
Heaney's despondency came from his personal acquaintance with the intractable divisions fueling the conflict. His farming family was Catholic and nationalist, in a land where power lay with Protestants and Unionists. He understood the sense of oppression felt by his community as British troops patrolled the fields and lanes near the family farm in County Derry. But Heaney's instinct was always to seek common ground. And as he struggled to find his poetic voice against the backdrop of the Troubles, he found inspiration in the landscape that was at the heart of the conflict. The countryside where he grew up had always been fertile ground for Heaney's poetic imagination.
Words for me seem to have more nervous energy when they are touching the place that I know, that I live with.
For Heaney, the power of the landscape lay not in its superficial beauty, but in the memories it stored beneath the surface.
We have no prairies to slice a big sun at evening. Everywhere the eye concedes to encroaching horizon is wooed into the cyclops eye of a tarn. Our unfenced country is bog that keeps crusting between the sights of the sun.
This is Seamus Heaney's world, really. Bogland. He was living in the middle of contested territory, conflict about land that goes way back, to the 16th century and even before that. But there's something about this space that is elemental, that has kind of nothing to do with those, awful human ambitions and hatreds and quarrels somehow.
Heaney was fascinated by how the unique chemical properties of the bog act as nature's great preserver, embalming organic matter for millennia, turning this landscape into the memory bank of the nation.
They've taken the skeleton of the great Irish elk out of the peat, set it up an astounding crate full of air. The ground itself is kind black butter, melting and opening underfoot, missing its last definition by millions of years.
And there's a sense in which prehistoric time is actually captured literally under all these layers of bog, of peat. And Heaney, looks down at something that exists in enormous spans of time with which you then have a direct kind of communion.
Our pioneers keep striking inwards and downwards. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. The bog holes might be Atlantic seepage. The wet center is bottomless.
In the bogland that makes up vast tracts of the Irish landscape, Heaney found a place of connection with the deep past, which offered the possibility to imagine an Ireland transcending the tribal divisions of the unforgiving present.
You have this kind of powerful emotional and psychological connection with generation after generation after generation, the human chain. It's an eternal landscape. It's contemptuous of the kind of screaming and shouting and bombing and gunning down that's going on in the streets and, above ground.
By the late 60s, Heaney was one of the most acclaimed poets of his generation. And as the violence escalated, he came under pressure to lend the power of his poetry to the Republican cause.
So he enters and sits down opposite and goes for me head on. When, for fuck's sake, are you going to write something for us? If I do write something, whatever it is, I'll be writing for myself. And that was that.
For a time, Heaney found himself trapped between his desire for creative freedom and his sense of obligation to engage directly with the rising body count. He began to search for what he called images and symbols adequate to our predicament.
The first thing that seized me really were the photographs. And in particular, one photograph of a head of a man known as the Tulland Man.
Heaney came across these images in a book about ancient bodies over 2,000 years old, victims of sacrificial violence, discovered in the 1950s in the bogs of Denmark.
The Tulland Man is one of the most perfectly preserved humans in all of existence, really. Because inside the peat bog, skin is preserved, hair is preserved, internal organs are preserved. So you can actually see his stubble, his closed eyelids. The man looks as though he's still alive, but is asleep. The rope, of course, makes it clear that something awful has happened to this man and he's been ritually killed. There's a religious sacrifice. So he describes the photographs as opening a gate for him. And he feels an instant kind of extraordinary communion, really, between his own world of bogland and this perfectly preserved body. And it suddenly changes the way he can make connections between the troubles, which are absolutely escalated by religious fury and hatred, and the violence which had happened to the Tulland Man. So it set him off. And he writes one of the great poems of the 20th century. And it begins with the apparition of the body itself.
Someday I will go to Aarhus to see his peat-brown head the mild pods of his eyelids, his pointed skin cap. In the flat country nearby where they dug him out, his last gruel of winter seeds caked in his stomach, naked except for the cap, noose, and girdle, I will stand a long time.
And then there's a huge switch in that he's been sacrificed to a kind of pagan goddess. And there's a sense in which the peat bog is a goddess that actually opens for the body to be kind of received.
Bridegroom to the goddess, she tightened her torque on him and opened her fen, those dark juices working him to a saint's kept body.
The middle of the poem is getting closer to Northern Ireland. And he switches to something that is very much part of that 20th century horror. And that was the story of 4 young men who were killed during the troubles of the 1920s, who were dragged by a train past the Heaney family's own farm backyard.
The scattered, ambushed flesh of labourers, stockinged corpses laid out in the farmyards, telltale skin and teeth flecking the sleepers of 4 young brothers trailed for miles along the lines.
And then there's an extraordinary last quatrain in the whole poem.
Out there, in Jutland, in the old man-killing parishes, I will feel lost, unhappy, and at home.
The fact that he used the words parishes brings you right into the middle of Ulster. I will feel lost, unhappy, and at home. So he'd been laboring to find some way of talking about the Troubles in his poems that wasn't crassly literal. And this was it. This kind of absolutely wired together connection of this remote past and what's going on now is just perfectly nailed at that point. So it's a beautiful, upsetting, profound, extraordinary vision of humanity, what humans can do to each other.
This poem, with its quiet focus on the human cost of violence across the arc of history, drew fire from critics in Northern Ireland for seeming to sidestep the immediate circumstances of the Troubles. But at a time when the din of shouting, cursing, and mutual hatred was deafening,
Show the world where Ulster stands.
Heaney's steadfast commitment to his own creative vision and his belief over the long decades of conflict that we have more in common than what divides us provided hope to millions. And his poetry remains a beacon of our common humanity today.
Right now, what the world, feeds on is exactly what Seamus Heaney didn't do. In other words, being installed in mutually warring tribal camps and degrading your enemy. It's either my way of thinking or nothing. So the poetry is a fantastic antidote to that kind of mutual screaming. And what poetry and what great art can do in such murderously polarized times sounds so little and footnotish and decorative and ephemeral, and it is all none of those things. It's a mighty force.
The mighty force of Heaney's poetry won him the Nobel Prize for Literature and secured his place in the hearts of the Irish people.
It was a welcome that is generally reserved for sporting heroes, Ireland's newest Nobel laureate and the voice of his people in good times.
And Heaney's words provided inspiration during the long, drawn-out peace process, which culminated in the Good Friday Agreement in 1998.
Once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme.
Heaney has always been an inspiration to another artist,
U2's Bono, who played his own crucial role in securing the path to peace.
I used to give his poetry away to people as a sort of activist. When I went to a meeting, you know, across the world, all over Africa, I gave the Pope Seamus Heaney's verse. 2 popes.
So, Bono, say a bit about what you think Seamus might have contributed to the ending of the horror, whether he, you know, his poetry made a difference.
But he's trying to get you away from the obvious topsoil. He's just saying,
he would
deeper
describe it that
into
way
who
too.
you are, dig deeper into the place. You know, just look to deeper roots than the ones that people were fighting over. The excavation, the archaeology of the human spirit that we associate with Seamus Heaney brought him to a more interesting place, which is the sacred to be found in the ordinary.
Yeah. When you think about what the end of the brutality of the Troubles, it is the kind of glory of ordinariness being restored to Ireland.
And the peacemakers, their process, there's no romance. Peacemakers in general win with stamina. And the stale sandwiches and grandiose people like myself, we dramatize these things, but they're so mundane.
Yeah, you're right, but you're selling yourself short, actually, as well, because actually there is a theatre. I mean, you did the gig in Belfast. That surely made a difference. In the way poetry can make a difference, you and music made a difference that moment.
The leaders of the Ulster Unionist Party and the SDLP joined U2 on stage at a pop concert this evening to promote a yes vote in Friday's referendum on the peace agreement.
There was a fear that it wasn't going to pass. So it was suggested to me that maybe U2 could play a role in this. We had been very vocal about the paramilitaries on both sides. And that sort of outrage, which rock and roll bands are good at, endeared us with 2 communities.
Yeah.
We were already a bit jaded about, you know, what our manager used to call pulling us just rock against bad things, is it, Bono? And so I was like, okay, I know we've got to do this and we've got to be smart about it. And the idea was, I said, we'll do it if we get John Hume and David Trimble out on the stage.
Out of the past and into the future on this stage.
But I said, you can't speak. And to ask politicians not to speak isn't, no, it's just impossible, because that's what they do. But it worked, because these 2 men had to shake hands publicly, and by just the graphic art of the picture, that shot went everywhere. And I mean, it was a close call, but I think the concert helped. We were told that it helped. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, because culture is always upstream of politics. You know, that's the shape of ideas. That's why culture matters. That's why Seamus Heaney matters.
The end of art is peace, could be the motto of this frail device.
Amidst the horror of a deadly war, the landscape offered Heaney the chance to connect with the long arc of history and find common ground. For another artist, nature also offered the chance of finding peace, but in very different circumstances. The 1980s was London's hedonistic heyday, making it a magnet for all those wanting to blaze their own trail in the world. At its heart was artist and experimental filmmaker Derek Jarman, the enfant terrible of the London art scene. Jarman thrived on the energy of the city and lived his life
at the heart of London's queer culture, making films that celebrated homoerotic desire in a way the country wasn't quite ready for.
We're told that the film is as much about the artist Derek Jarman as it is about Caravaggio. In which case, I must report that Mr. Jarman seems fond of photographing bums of the male variety. I'm demanding my money back.
Jarman's provocative work was a constant exercise in kicking down boundaries and challenging convention.
As long as the music's loud enough, we won't hear the world falling apart.
Its prime target is a human white blood cell. Usually the linchpin of the body's immune defense system, this cell is crippled. And on the verge.
But in 1986, Jarman's own world fell apart when he received a life-changing diagnosis.
So many friends dead or dying since autumn. All the brightest and the best trampled to death. Surely even the Great War brought no more loss into one life in just 12 months. And all this as we made love, not war.
Against all the odds, this is one of the most beautiful, moving places I think I've ever been in. It's a garden, but a very unlikely garden. It's a garden on the edge of the sea. There's kind of bristling salt marsh out there and a nuclear power station. And Derek Jarman created this garden when he knew he wasn't long for the world, when he'd been diagnosed with AIDS. All his friends are dying in London, and he's thinking about something that will live after them. There are poppies everywhere, and poppies we think of as, life after death in a way. They're kind of memorial flowers. And here they're not red, they're yellow, they're golden. And this garden in this unlikely place, it's full of joy. It's full of kind of joie de vivre, even though he's dying.
A few months before his diagnosis, Jarman had purchased this small fisherman's cottage in Dungeness on the Kent coast. And for the rest of his life, this unpromising patch of shingle in the shadow of a nuclear power station would become the focus of his creative energy.
Gardening is what I should always have done. I shouldn't have become involved in cinema. That's for fools. Gardening is central because, gardening, one is entering into another time, into eternals and returns and cycles. Those are the resurrectional cycles in my life. Planting the mullein seed and watching it come up.
And his absolutely fantastic book, is one of the great books about nature, called Modern Nature. Up there with Dorothy Wordsworth and Coleridge and the best writers on nature. He writes that he'd always loved gardening as a little boy in his parents' house. So he created, against all the odds, this extraordinary place. There are these kind of salty, violent winds that ripped out his irises, did horrible damage to his roses, and you just feel the unforgiving work as he dug inside these shingles. He woke up to the destruction when yet another storm came crashing past the cottage, and he carried on doing it. He wanted those last years of his life to be this, things that bloom and blossom and give light and happiness. And he created something gorgeous.
Here, Jarman tapped into one of the deepest well springs of traditional British life, gardening. But his garden was not simply a therapeutic escape.
Already the homosexual community is finding itself the target of hatred and discrimination. Even a bishop said that he found it difficult to shake hands with an AIDS sufferer. A private member's...
His garden was a work of art which, in a time of paranoia and hostility towards the gay community, distilled his vision of how the world should be. not divided, but a place of acceptance and inclusivity.
And what I really love about this place is that it is not a classic English garden. Derek collected driftwood. This garden is full of bits of rusting iron, old anchor chains. There's even the power station in gorgeous kind of harmony with the most beautiful flowers. He kind of knew that they kind of collided together. They made a kind of mess together. And Derek Jarman was all about the happiness of mess. So what we have here is the meeting place of humanity. He did not want to do a garden with fences, with hedges. You know, this is someone for whom there are no barriers. He said the boundary is the horizon. And that I think is kind of profoundly moving.
As his flowers bloomed, Jarman faded. But he found what he described as extraordinary peacefulness. He connected to one of our most powerful yearnings, to find in nature consolation for our mortality.
The sun comes up in the front of the house and it goes down and back. And I see the sun all day if it's there. And I can see the sea. And the great thing about the sea is it changes every colour you could imagine. I've seen the sea pink and brown and aquamarine and black. I sit and watch this. And somehow you have to sit there and watch this happening.
Jarman really, I think, is thought of rightly, you know, as a genius for inspirational comedy, for the dystopian wildness of punk breakdown in Britain. And he's wonderful at that. But it's when he comes here, he opens himself to illumination. He calms down. He's attentive. He's quiet. He knows time is running short, and therefore he wants to kind of not let go of the things that are really profound and important. And it leads him to connect the place in a visionary way with the great beyond, wherever the beyond it is that he's going.
So the haven Jarman created in this unfenced, unassuming patch of land, and the flowers he planted still battling against the wind, remain as a defiant cultural statement, asking us to stop and think about what kind of world we want to live in.
I look around towards the end of, long life, and you can't help thinking this is an epoch above all of distraction, where the difference between the profound and the trivial is being lost. The kind of idiot roar of the culture wars. The drone and the white noise, which makes it obligatory to stand in one camp or the other, and the two camps are at each other's throats, when culture actually does the opposite. Part of the power and the indispensability of culture is that it's for everybody. It's more likely to be a place where we can recognize what we have in common, which is not to say it's kind of warm and cuddly. The greatest works of art very often are the opposite, but they do give us a recognition of what we have in common as fallible human beings. So people need to think of art and culture not as an add-on to life, but actually as the difference between cultural life and death. I deeply think that it's there that we'll get the best shot of the endurance of humanity. At least, I sure hope so.
Moonlight whispers of stars above, like the way, holding you so close in the night we stay. Soft touch hearts collide in me keep endless nights with you. Every sky feels new. Love's our guiding light. Moments pure and true. Soft touch hearts collide.